Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is again the next 3 chapters or 50 pages in the United States penetration of Brazil. This podcast, I'm going to just shortly review what we discussed yesterday because I find it amusing. The fabrication courses, the fabrication courses of the United States government. This is actually just, funny. They have journalism fabrication courses for the whites of, the United States media to learn about how to fabricate stories. And they also have investigations courses on how to investigate and fabricate the results of investigations. This is all discussed in this book, fabrication courses. It also discusses police brutality courses, courses on how white police officers are most brutal to their, people. They're just most brutal to the people. They grab them, they choke them, they, show them how to snap their neck if needed. They show them how to obstruct their arteries in the neck to, kill them basically. So these are, white animals, white racist, genocidal, war criminal, American butchers. And that's, what they are. And I thought it was very amusing to find that somebody would have a police brutality course to, discuss how to take care of, prisoners, because these are political prisoners. These aren't regular prisoners. So I found that very amusing. And, they have all sorts of courses in Washington, and Fort Bragg's was the place. They have all sorts of courses about how to, do all sorts of subversive things in, democratic countries and, to subvert the democracy of the third world people. That's Washington and the United States of America's goal is to take away the democracy and replace the white capitalist, racist, murderous enslaver into power. So we're going to continue with 3 chapters containing rural unrest. It'll be part 3, transnational institutional interests and the interaction of military elite. So I'm going to just give you some background again. The Google Drive link for the book will be in the description section, so please download the book. I recommend you read it. I make small changes, so if you read the book, it's an excellent read, and it doesn't take so long. And I think people, especially people who are being persecuted by the white police, brutal monster racists of the U.S. government, need to have knowledge of these actions that they did, because previous action predicts future history. That's just the way life works. When you get a job as a doctor, your next job is dependent on how you performed in your past job. So if you were, a neurosurgeon that cut the wrong side of the brain and, killed, half your patients, the next job will be more difficult. Whereas the whites of Washington, the United States, don't do it that way. Their past history is hidden so that their next history is, more prestige. They get more prestige and they laugh. It's kind of a laughable circus of the United States government, Congress. It's a circus of joke prestige and racist pro-white prestige. So again, read the book at the Google Drive link. I recommend you read the book. So we would like to discuss certain key concepts of the chapters we have reviewed first. First is Celso Furtado, an economist of Brazil and promoter of Brazilian progress and peasant uplifting. He was the major Jao Goulart economist who was responsible for labor unions and labor promotion and peasant wages. Following the United States military coup by the racist whites of Washington, he was imprisoned and deprived of political rights by the U.S. government. He was not a criminal, but a political prisoner who was equated to a common criminal by the criminally insane government, gun-violent war criminal butchers of the United States. His major achievement of the Goulart government was SUDENE, that's SUDENE, which was the brainchild of Celso Furtado and the labor union force of Brazil, which answered directly to President Goulart and enjoyed administrative autonomy. It was responsible for the planning and execution of development projects. SUDENE was empowered to coordinate programs drawing both on national and foreign technical assistance. We should also discuss Anthony Russo, a member of the infamous RAND Corporation, who proclaimed that prisoner torture is great. Vietnam torture was excellent, a pro-Asian, murder white. Vietnamese prisoners, as well as prisoners that this white fraud capitalist refers to are not common criminals, but political prisoners who were murdered by the United States criminally insane war criminal butchers. Rand was also a key part of Indonesia coup, a group of murderers of white corporates who look to torture to feel that they are in control of prisoners, whether political or criminal. Mr. Russo said, quote, "You need to drop political prisoners into the sea. They're good for nothing." Political prisoners good for nothing, question mark. Political prisoners are leftists that the U.S. government, gun violent, criminally insane war criminals are unable to deal with as they are fascist oppressors of dissent, of their white supremacy fraud capitalism. Russo was also in favor of death squads in the United States, dealing with political prisoners in Brazil. He was in support of murdering them by dropping them into the ocean, similar to the slaves of Europe, into the sea. Anthony Russo, a racist white American murderous capitalist of Rand. Next, we address subversion of democracy, kidnapping and surveillance by knowing where the political adversaries are and then illegally abducting them against international laws is the name of the game. Theodore Brown is aide chief public safety advisor who promoted the lack of democratic elections in state governments in Brazil in favor of police capitalists serving autocrats. And also he promoted the use of police to overthrow the federal Brazilian government by using state governments and courses in the United States in training for subversion of democracy, police repression, and white American police brutality. He also questioned regarding the U.S. promotion of Brazilian death squads, which were used to deal with political prisoners by United States government, who was responsible for murder of these democratic and popular political forces in Brazil through individual abduction, murder, imprisonment, and in favor of military machine gun, violent white police terror government. The U.S. also used the state police in Brazil to overthrow Jao Goulart. They fortified state police with training courses to teach them how to enact a coup, how to overthrow, and how to deal with political prisoners by racist torture. Also, subversion was taught to the trainees of the Brazilian police in U.S. training centers. American white police brutality, the U.S. police force, and its racist training centers taught the Latin American police brutality through torture and murder, especially if political leftists and anyone with dissenting political viewpoints were in conflict with the U.S. gun violent criminal murdering war criminals. These Americans are criminally insane whites of the United States. Political prisoners are not criminals, but the U.S. fascist, gun violent, murderous butchers view them as equivalent to criminals, allowing them to release their programs of racist torture, kidnapping, and all sorts of genocidal technology and murder to deal with political prisoners with impunity and openly supported by their fascist United States. Surveillance and kidnapping of civilians was the focus of these courses, teaching the techniques to subjugate third world people with police repression, including death squads. These included police which were trained in the United States to torture with techniques of amputation, neck snapping, airway obstruction, and death, carotid massage, electric shock, and all are all given in the murder capital of the world, Washington, Fort Bragg, and other U.S. cities. One more course was discussed was press and journalism courses in the United States. These courses were involved with fabrication journalism, how to fabricate stories, propagate deliberate lies and fraud, and how to incorporate fabrication into democratic subversion. This is in line with the Americans' training program of state propaganda journalism and fraud reporting. And so that's it. We're going to just get started. Glad you could join us, and I hope we'll be done in 2 hours. I think we'll be done in 2 hours. Introduction. We have seen in the preceding section of various programs and initiatives undertaken by U.S. civilian agencies as well as by U.S. corporate entities in collaboration with government, were designed to weaken power holders and contenders who were viewed as unsympathetic toward the United States, to strengthen political and business elites who were viewed as potential allies, and in laying the groundwork for the 1964 coup to generate an atmosphere of chaos and fear. This section will deal with the manner in which U.S. military programs contributed to the technical capabilities of the Brazilian military, as well as to the officer corps' role orientation and collective self-image of the quote-unquote governing elite. In the early 1960s, it was suggested by Victor Alba, among others, that Latin American militarism was destined soon to wither away, as the military has no useful function, and as there was an emergent generation of U.S. trained, technocratically oriented, quote unquote, laboratory officers. A very different view was presented in 1961 by Joseph Novitsky of the New York Times, by a Brazilian leftist who said, "Whatever happens in Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Peru, the United States must accept partial responsibility. The missions taught the military how to think politically." The history of the role of the military in the political process of most Latin American countries indicates that these military establishments hardly needed instruction from the Colossus of the North in how to think politically. It is obvious, however, that Alba's assumption was equally inaccurate. It appears that for a highly significant portion of Brazil's military elite, the U.S. military has indeed served as a value-oriented reference group. But when, whether, and with what level of priority the United States has actually sought to discourage military seizures of power are questions that deserve more careful consideration, along with the question of whether the U.S. military can be regarded as a reliable repository of what have generally been assumed to be the prevailing social and political values of the U.S. citizenry. Some of the mythology surrounding the relationship between U.S. policy, military policy and programs in particular, and the behavior of Latin American military establishments can be laid to rest by examining the names of the relationships between U.S. and Brazilian military elites in light of the institutional characteristics and self-interest of the military. These relationships suggest that the military, at least in the Western Hemisphere, might be regarded as a transnational subculture rather than as a repository of national values. Many high-ranking officials of the U.S. defense establishment have expressed the opinion that the most valuable aspect of military assistance program for Latin America is the training of Latin officers. One of the supposed dividends that has always been presented in advocacy or justification of the training programs is the indoctrination of the Latin officers in domestic ideas and values that results from their exposure to U.S. military institutions and contacts with U.S. advisors. On April 9, 1962, Defense Secretary McNamara told a Senate committee, "Probably the greatest return in our military assistance investment dollar comes from the training of selected officers and key specialists of our military schools and training centers in the United States and overseas. I need not dwell upon the value of having in positions of leadership men who have firsthand knowledge of how Americans do things and how they think. Each of these men will receive the exposure to democracy at work." Between 1960 and 1969, 18 regimes in Latin America, of which 11 had held office constitutionally, were overthrown by the military. By 1969, more than two-thirds of the people in Latin America were living under military dictatorships. It might be expected that in profit-conscious societies, such a return on the investment would be considered less than impressive. But General Robert Porter, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Southern Command, nerve center of the U.S. military activity in Latin America, stated in 1968 that dollar for dollar, U.S. training assistance pays the greatest dividends of any of our military assistance programs in Latin America. The allegation that exposure to United States officers and institutions will generate democratic attitudes within Latin American military establishments rests upon the number of assumptions that will be made explicit and re-examined in the following chapters. Among these are that value-oriented ambient of the U.S. military officer corps is a democratic system, that the predominant direction of influence through such contacts is from U.S. civilian policymakers to U.S. officers of Latin officers, that the worldview held and proselytized by U.S. officers is consistent with the advocacy of civilian supremacy and democratic government generally, as set forth, for example, in the U.S. and in most Latin American constitutions, and for Latin America in particular, that U.S. military policies and programs are conducive to the establishment and protection of democratic systems, and that overall U.S. objectives in the hemispheres are interpreted by those who make and or implement military policy, dictate the promotion of democratic self-government in the Latin American states. So just a quick comment. So you can see the U.S. training programs, for white police brutality, the brutality of the American white police forces, discussed at length. He discussed all the different courses that they have, why they are, subverting democracy, imprisoning political prisoners, and being just, white, brutal, terrorist American police officers. That's what he's discussing. We're going to continue chapter 9, the special relationships between U.S. and Brazilian military elites. In Senate hearings in 1971, Major General George Beatty, chairman of the U.S. delegation to the Joint Brazil-U.S. Military Commission and subsequently director of the Inter-American Defense College, asserted that Brazil's armed forces have been largely oriented since World War II. This orientation is the result of close professional collaborations between United States and Brazilian armed forces over the years. Brazil has adopted U.S. military doctrine, tactics, and techniques, and has, until recently, almost exclusively sought U.S. equipment and logistics support. This chapter traces some of the means through which the Brazilian military came to depend largely on the U.S. equipment to adapt U.S. tactics and techniques and to internalize and adapt U.S. military doctrines to its own institutional needs. The expansion of U.S. military programs in Brazil. The beginnings of a special relationship between the U.S. and Brazilian military elites can be traced back to 1922 when a U.S. naval mission, the first in South America, was established in Brazil. U.S. Army and Navy Air Force missions followed in the late 1930s. A number of Brazilian officers had been trained in Germany prior to World War I. However, at a French Army mission, diffused its concepts of military professionalism among the Brazilian officer corps from 1919 until its departure in 1940. So it was not until World War II that the United States acquired a near monopoly over the training and equipping of the Brazilian armed forces. The personnel of the U.S. missions already in Brazil served as the U.S. representation of the Joint Brazilian-United States Military Commission, JBUSMC, which coordinated the military activities of the two countries during the war. Collaboration was extensive. The United States sent ships, planes, ground equipment, and tens of thousands of troops to protect the Brazilian Bulge and made use of Brazilian air bases, ports, and other facilities, especially for transporting supplies to North Africa. The Brazilian Navy cooperated in patrolling the South Atlantic, and the Brazilian Army and Air Force provided some 20,000 or 30,000 troops for a Brazilian expeditionary force in the Italian campaign. The Brazilian armed forces emerged from World War II completely re-equipped and re-outfitted by the U.S. Army. Their new equipment even included U.S. Army-issued clothing. Some Brazilians complained in the post-war years that the only Brazilian thing in that Independence Day parade was the flag. In 1947 and 1948, the U.S. sold ground equipment for an entire infantry division, other light equipment, and over 100 combat aircraft to Brazil at approximately 10% of procurement costs as surplus disposals. And in 1949, at the urging of the Brazilian officers who had fought alongside the United States and Italy, the U.S. military assisted in the establishment of the Brazilian Superior War College, Escola Superior de Guerra, ESG. The school was modeled after the U.S. National War College, and a U.S. advisory mission remained in the ESG until 1960, when the U.S. contingent was reduced to a single liaison officer. That officer, who has full faculty privileges, offers advice on curricula and provides the school with U.S. training manuals, military journals, and other materials. Agreement was reached in 1952 between the U.S. and Brazilian military establishment for the inclusion of Brazil in the U.S. Mutual Defense Assistance Program. The Vargas government delayed its entry into force until 1953, but excess stock grants for the program's first year alone, fiscal 1953 amounted to 52.8 million US dollars. The wartime JBUSMC had continued to function as the agency for military collaboration between the two countries, and in 1954 it was given permanent status and registered with the United Nations as an international agency. The only other Latin American country that maintains such a joint commission with the United States is Mexico, which has not participated in the bilateral assistance program. At the same time, Joint Brazil-United States Defense Commission was created as the Washington counterpart of the JBUSMC. The former is headed by a Brazilian, the latter by a North American. The military assistance and sales and other aspects of military cooperation, with the exception of attaché matters, are channeled through these two agencies. The U.S. military Group, a centralized command structure established in the early 1960s to incorporate the missions of the three service and the military assistance advisory groups, is in most countries receiving bilateral assistance, is formally known in Brazil as the U.S. delegation to the JBUSMC. The Joint Commission in Washington is an ad hoc body composed of those three American delegates detailed from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and three Brazilian military attachés. Attaché posts of the Brazilian embassy are generally a reward for services performed or preparation for higher offices. Medici was an attaché and a member of that commission just prior to being selected for the presidency in 1969, as was General Orlando Giselle before becoming Minister of War. The Commission network links the military establishment of the two countries more closely than would the Mill Group arrangement, as it provides a more direct communication link. The U.S. delegation to the JBUSMC, which shares office space with the Brazilian delegation, may communicate with the JCS either through the U.S. Southern Command, Southcom, in Panama, or directly through its counterpart commission in Washington. The delegation's activities and communications theoretically take place under the guidance of the chief of the diplomatic mission, but in practice that is not necessarily the case. The JBUSMC agreement provides that the functions of the U.S. delegations shall include maintaining constant liaison by personal confederate conferences and visits with appropriate Brazilian governmental departments and agencies, i.e. the Ministry of Finance, Chief of Police, Director of Traffic, Post Office Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Inspector of Customs, Post Director, and the Vehicle Registrations Bureau. In order to facilitate JBUSMC interests within these agencies, among the U.S. Defense Department's stated objectives for the twin commissions was to facilitate preparation of joint military planning between the two governments. In a letter of July 1970 from Assistant Secretary of State Charles Mayer to Senator William Fulbright explained that the U.S. military mission in Brazil helps the host government assess the threat of the nation's security and counsels on the strategy and tactics for dealing with the threat. In 1958, this delegation, or Mill Group, consisted of 102 persons. The size of the group grew steadily until 1968, when it peaked at about 200. By 1973, the authorized size of the group had been reduced to 60. U.S. grants and credits to Brazil under the Military Assistance Program amounted to $93.3 million for the period from 1931 through 1951 through 1955, $97 million from 1956 through 1960, $113 million from 1961 through 1965, and $108 million from 1966 through 1970. About two-thirds of the total for the entire period was in the form of grants. Most economic assistance, by contrast, has been in the form of loans. Much of this grant assistance has been for the training of 6,858 Brazilians in the United States and the Panama Canal Zone between 1950 and 1970. In addition to the service attaches and the JBUSMC, U.S. military representation in Brazil in 1971 included members of the Inter-American Geodetic Survey, the Naval Communications Technical Group, the Defense Research Office Latin America, and a liaison attachment from the Military Airlift Command. The survey team works with Brazilian counterparts in producing geographic cartographic and geophysical information and topographic maps on Brazil. In exchange for its assistance, the United States receives copies of the maps produced. The NAVCOM Tech Group originated as a compromise measure to preserve the use of U.S. owned and operated radio installed in Rio de Janeiro during World War II. Rather than vacating the facility after the war, the U.S. Navy reached an agreement with the Brazilian Navy whereby the NAVCOM Tech Group is to provide technical training and operational assistance to the Brazilian Navy in order to make possible the communications assistance of the Brazilian Navy communication system to the U.S. Navy and other U.S. government agencies. At Senate hearings in 1971, Major General George Bealty, chairman of the U.S. delegation to the JBU SMC, testified that without the facility, the U.S. Navy would be unable to communicate with some of its vessels in the South Atlantic, but he conceded that the Brazilian government could close down the operation anytime it chose to. The Defense Research Office, established in 1962, served as a contact point for South American scientists and research agencies for receiving and evaluating research proposals pertinent to R&D missions of the U.S. The MAC liaison facilitates the arrival, maintenance, loading, and dispatch of the one MAC flight each week, which General Beatty explained brings both people and things. John Duncan Powell has pointed out a number of ways in which seemingly small relative to the country's GNP or national resources amount of material assistance to a military establishment can be highly significant in terms of institutional autonomy and sheer physical power vis-a-vis contending political groups. But historically, in most Latin American countries, including Brazil, the military itself has reflected the political cleavages of the larger national society. Thus, both critics and defenders of the program generally agree that training with its potentialities for political indoctrination and the development of personal ties has been the most consequential aspect of U.S. military assistance to Latin America. Training and political indoctrination. Even before the heyday of counterinsurgency, U.S. institutions engaged in the training of Latin American officials proceeded on the assumption that Latin American primary contributions to the defense of the free world were to be the maintenance of internal order and prevention of subversive activities. Much of the doctrinal and practical content was to be incorporated into the training for this geographically confined but functionally expanded military role, represented a refinement of the techniques employed by the U.S. Marines in Central America and the Caribbean in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, and of the methods devised to isolate or repress potential enemies in the Western Hemisphere during World War II. A precedent had been established for formal instruction in unconventional warfare as early as 1924 to 1925, when Lieutenant Colonel W.P. Upshur, who had fought guerrillas Cacos in Haiti, initiated a lecture series at the Quantico, Virginia Field Officer School on the conduct of small wars, a term applied to those years of the pacification of less developed peoples by major powers. By 1932, the course had been expanded and was directed by Major General Utley, who had commanded Marine forces in eastern Nicaragua. The lessons of Marine engagements in Latin America, along with examinations of operations ranging from the French conquest of Indochina to the Battle of Little Big Horn, and are set forth in the Marine Corps Small Wars Manual, published in 1940, for the protection of the interests of the United States and the property of U.S. citizens in countries threatened by revolution. The manual offered precise instructions for gathering intelligence, running a military government, patrolling waterways and jungles, bombing and stafing of villages, attacking houses, and a variety of other specific operations. The occupying forces were reminded to consider the reaction of the American public as anti-interventionist propaganda could normally be expected from Congress and the press. The manual anticipated that no declaration of war would be sought, that such small wars would be fought solely under executive authority. Further, it noted that such wars are conducted often with precarious responsibility and doubtful authority under indeterminate orders lacking specific instructions, and that the force commander might have to deduce his mission from the general intent of higher authority or even from the foreign policy of the United States. The process of intervening in a pre-revolutionary or revolutionary country was divided into 5 phases, which incidentally bear a striking resemblance to the sequence of events in the U.S. intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1965. After the Marines had dribbled in numbers strong enough to achieve their objectives, the second phase occupation of principal cities and economically vital areas, placing garrison in fortified posts and sending out small patrols, would be undertaken. While extending their control over the host country, the Marines were to establish a constabulary or native army. Constabulary units were to take charge of civil affairs projects, such as flood and earthquake relief, in order to gain the confidence of law-abiding natives, and in the third phase would begin to assume some responsibility for policing their country. In the third phase, however, the Marines would assume control, direct or indirect, depending on the circumstances, of local executive agencies, and Marines would retain major responsibility for anti-guerrilla activities until lawless elements were subdued. Thereafter, preparations would begin for free and fair elections, quotation marks in manual. There were to be 2 electoral agencies, a National Board of Elections staffed by natives, and an American electoral mission, which was to exercise actual control. In the fifth phase, natives would assume control of domestic affairs, and Marines would depart, leaving perhaps a legation behind. The manual is laced with contradictions. It admonished the Marines to be nonpartisan, while making it clear that they would be intervening for partisan reasons, to keep revolutionaries out of power, to protect the property of U.S. citizens, and to remove or pressure local governments as U.S. interests, as they interpret them, dictate. The political neutrality of the constabulary was to be assured by screening of candidates by the Marines and the assistance of local officials, as well as by good pay and proper discipline. When possible, this nonpartisan constabulary was to replace the Marines in guarding the polls, to give the impression that elections were conducted under native control, although it was also suggested that patrols of warplanes be sent over outlying areas to give voters tangible evidence that they are receiving protection in the exercise of their civil rights. The manual cautioned the Marines against acting superior to the natives, but it emphasized their civilizing mission. Enlisted men were to be indoctrinated prior to the landing in the racial characteristics, quote unquote, of the target country, and including whether those characteristics incline the natives to be corrupt, excitable superstitions, vacillating or susceptible to propaganda. They were instructed also that if the country had high illiteracy rate, its inhabitants would tend to be childlike. The intervention was described as, quote, friendly assistance, but it was conceded that a majority would see the intervention as an unfriendly act to be opposed in the interest of self-preservation, and that all natives were therefore to be viewed as potential enemies. It was also conceded that in the process of defeating the insurgents, who would probably be indistinguishable from and aided by ordinary citizens, the lives and property of friendly and neutral natives would be endangered as well. Finally, the Marines were instructed to deal with the political, social, and economic problems that give rise to revolutionary feelings. Yet they were encouraged to cooperate with local governments whose tyrannical acts, the manual stated, might have led to the insurgency. It was also recommended that the Marines go along with class distinctions, and it was understood, of course, that they would be there to protect U.S. holdings that were part of an economic status quo benefiting foreigners in natives at natives' expense. Benefiting foreigners at natives' expense. The small wars that had provided the insights for the manual had been fought almost exclusively against poorly organized and poorly equipped native forces. The authors of the manual felt that anti-revolutionary interventions would continue indefinitely, but that they would become increasingly difficult. Civil affairs as a regular component of military training, initially of U.S. officers, but later of foreign officers and enlisted men as well, was an outgrowth of World War II. The experience of the U.S. Armed Forces in governing civilian populations, both foreign and domestic, dated back to the war with Mexico and the Civil War, but it was not until martial law was declared in Hawaii, in the wake of Pearl Harbor and the West Coast, Japanese and other supposed enemy aliens were interned that the issue of specialized training in political, military, or civil affairs assumed urgency. An order of April 2, 1942, by the Secretary of War established a school to be known as the School of Military Government at the University of Virginia, and the first course, with 50 officers in attendance, opened on May 11, 1942. The issue, however, was whether governing civilians, friendly or enemy, was a job for the military, had not been resolved. The press has dealt disdainfully with the new school for military government, and a number of civilian departments and agencies either had mandates to engage in foreign administration or could claim such authority by extension of their domestic domains. Following a stormy cabinet meeting on October 29, 1942, President Roosevelt informed Secretary of War Stimson that he had regarded governing civilian territory as predominantly a civilian task. However, after a year's conclusive effort to bring civilian agencies into play, the president conceded to Stimson that it is apparent that if prompt results are to be obtained, the Army will have to assume the initial burden. The School of Military Government graduated its last class in Charlottesville in February 1946, but it reopened in March at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, and since then, as the Army Civil Affairs Court at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and Fort Bragg, North Carolina. It has maintained a continuous existence. From its inception, this school has sought to impart area of expertise as well as training in the techniques of government. In uneasy coexistence between the terms military government, quote unquote, civil affairs, quote unquote, was finally resolved when it was decided that civil affairs was military government conducted in one's own or friendly territory, and military government was civil affairs conducted in enemy territory. The training in unconventional warfare and the conduct of small wars was to assume increasing importance for the hemisphere when, as counterinsurgency training, it was extended in the early 1960s through the military assistance program to the Latin American military establishments. The insurgents or potential insurgents these Latin Americans were being trained to deal with as the enemy were their own compatriots, and the government they were being treated to operate through civic action and civil affairs programs were their own. More than 140 military installations in the continental United States, CONAs, were accommodating foreign military trainees in the mid-1960s. Furthermore, the Panama Canal Zone, in addition to serving as the headquarters for the U.S. Southern Command, had become a special center for training Latin American military personnel in the U.S. Armed Forces version of the political science of the Cold War and the internal security techniques required for winning it. More than 200,000 Latin American officers and men have been trained in the United States, and an additional 30,000 men in the Canal Zone since World War II. General Robert Wood, Military Assistance Director, claimed in 1965 that nearly all of Latin Americans commissioned and non-commissioned officers have been trained either in the States or in Panama. All U.S. training programs for foreign military personnel, including the programs of the Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia, and the Artillery School at Fort Still, Oklahoma, where large numbers of Latin Americans are trained, and the Defense Language Institute English Language School, Lackland Air Force Base, and equips incoming officers for further training, include a certain amount of political indoctrination. But the CONUS courses and programs most sensitive to shifts in political strategy, and those apparently considered to by the U.S. Armed Forces most important for the training of Latin American officers, have included the Special Officers Course, Psychological Operations, and Civil Military Operations, formerly the Civil Affairs School of Fort Gordon, Georgia, consolidated in the early 1970s at the Institute for Military Assistance, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The Senior Foreign Officers Intelligence Course at Fort Huachua, Arizona, and the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Foreign officers also attended the academic war colleges and Command and General Staff Colleges of the U.S. service branches and enroll in correspondence courses offered by U.S. National War College and the Industrial College of the Armed Forces. These correspondence courses have been incorporated into the curricula of the military staff or war colleges of a number of Latin American countries, including Brazil. Most of the U.S. schools that train foreign officers have intensive follow-up programs to maintain contact with graduates. These include the free distribution of the school's journals and other materials, often in the host country's language, the formation of alumni clubs, and the inclusion of graduates in social affairs sponsored by U.S. military groups abroad. The upbeat mood of these schools in the early 1960s is suggested by an article in the University Quarterly Review, summer 1963. It begins, "The Air Force recognizes the increasing tempo of technological advances, the significant economic, political, and social developments having international implications, and the expanding mission of the military. The related urgent requirement for every officer to continue his education throughout his career is increasingly evident." The school generally considered the most important in cementing relations with upwardly mobile foreign officers is the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, CGSC. Although the school has accepted foreign officers since 1893, most of the influx of Allied, and particularly Latin American officers, has taken place since World War II. The Latin American officers selected for training at Fort Leavenworth fall into two categories: political comer and the political exile. According to Colonel DeForest Ballou, former director of the Strategic Studies Program, the school became particularly concerned around 1960 and 1961 with the need for a greater understanding by the military of communism, the Cold War, and international relations generally, and attention was focused on questions like, quote, "Why is it that politics is important to the military?" At about the same time, the massive increase in overseas assignments for military advisors drew attention to the Third World and to counterinsurgency doctrine and tactics. By the early 1970s, in response to the Nixon doctrine, even greater emphasis was being placed on the maintenance of internal security in the Third World. The curriculum the CGSC offered to U.S. and foreign students alike includes strategic studies utilizing, for example, the World Politics Stimulator, security assistance, including internal security, counterinsurgency, nation building, and military assistance. Security assistance training has been described as, quote, largely political science with heavy use of case studies. Operations, including civil disturbance and offensive and retrograde retreat operations, employment of weapons, including nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, intelligence, decision-making, and management, and civil affairs. Bellows said that the courses most often selected as electives by foreign officers are in the categories of strategic studies and security assistance. As in most other U.S. schools, foreign officers are encouraged to contribute to classroom presentations when the topic under discussion involves their countries. In 1973, there were 6 allied officers on the faculty. The only Latin American among them was a Brazilian who was contributing in particular to instruction in security assistance. Manuals produced for the CGSC are translated and distributed to schools in the Canal Zone and throughout Latin America. The school's journal, Military Review, also has very broad circulation among Allied military establishments. A Portuguese language edition has been published in Brazil since 1952, and one or more Brazilians has served on the editorial staff for at least a decade. An article published in a journal in 1964 explained that the CGSC was attempting to show students how U.S. strategy combines in proper proportion all elements of national power, political, economic, psychological, and military. It has been responsible to the Army's growing worldwide responsibilities that the college has increased its instruction dealing with strategic matters. The curriculum could not ignore that the search for victory in the Cold War struggles has placed additional responsibilities on the military man at all echelons. CGSC graduates had by no means shirked their additional responsibilities. In 1973, the school boasted that among the graduates were about 90 heads of state, cabinet ministers, and chiefs of staff. A hall of fame was being compiled to commemorate their achievements. Journal Ernesto Guizol, who assumed the presidency of Brazil in 1974, is an alumnus of the CGSC. The training complex in the Panama Canal Zone includes the School of the Americas, Army at Fort Gulick, the Inter-American Air Force Academy at Albrook Air Force Base, the smaller Inter-American Geodetic Survey School at Fort Clayton, operated jointly by three service branches, and the U.S. Army Jungle Warfare School at Fort Sherman. The School of the Americas was officially opened in 1949 and by 1956 was offering courses exclusively in Spanish and Portuguese. This school counts so many political leaders among its alumni that it is known throughout Latin America as the, quote, Escuela de Golpes, quote unquote, coup d'etat school. From the beginning, the U.S. interpretation of Latin American role in the Cold War served as the framework for instruction, but in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, renewed emphasis was placed on internal security and riot control. General Andrew O'Meara, Commander-in-Chief of the Southern Command, affirmed in 1962 that the traditional political influence goals of the training would be strengthened by assigning highest priority to anti-communism. By 1967, close to 70% of the school's course hours were allocated to internal security instructions, and in the 1969 catalog, even the supposedly technical courses sounded more like political science. The course entitled Radio Operator E23, for example, was described as follows. Irregular warfare encompasses the causes and backgrounds of insurgent movements, nature of communist threats in Latin America, the political, military, and community development programs that should be instituted by the government to control insurgent movements at any stage of development. 40 students, 14 weeks for enlistees who passed the Morse code aptitude test. And the course entitled Basic Medical Technician was described as, quote unquote, intelligence and security includes nature of the communist world insurgency threat, countering the insurgency threat. 40 students, 20 weeks for non-coms with an elementary school education. Descriptive training pamphlets on communism emphasize the major goal of communist insurgents in third world countries is isolating those countries from the United States. Thus, communist elements seek to take advantage of nationalistic sentiments among the populace. One special forces training exercise at Fort Gulick involves the organization of a guerrilla force to resort to restore a deposed pro-Western government. Regular courses for Latin American officers were initiated at Albrook Air Force Base in 1943, in addition to training in technical skills such as aircraft maintenance. Albrook's program has expanded since the early 60s to include nation building and civic action, special air operations and counterinsurgency, jungle and water survival, and the use of napalm. The Jungle Warfare School at Fort Sherman, in operation since 1952, served as a model for the Brazilians, who, with the U.S. equipment and technical assistance, established their own Jungle Warfare School in Manaus in the mid-1960s. A U.S. military attaché stationed in Brazil in the 1960s maintained that Brazilian military had concluded that its training offered in the Canal Zone was not rigorous enough. The Brazilian school now accepts trainees from other Latin American countries as well as from the United States. In addition to those trained in the continental United States and the Canal Zone, the indeterminate number of Latin American military personnel has been trained in their own countries by U.S. mobile training teams. The program began with the activation in 1963 of the Army's 3rd Civil Affairs Detachment from Fort Clayton in the Canal Zone. Mobile training teams were also provided by the Special Air Warfare Center, Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, the 800-man U.S. 8th Special Forces Group, Green Berets, from Fort Gulick, and the 605th Air Commando Squadron from Howard Air Force Base in the Canal Zone. The Air Force Special Operations Force, secretly established in 1961, has carried out extensive training in Latin America, and in the early 1970s maintained air commando units at Eglin Air Force Base, as well as the Canal Zone. Not to be outdone, the Navy Seabees maintain their own mobile technical assistance team at both the Atlantic and the Pacific. One aspect of this in-country training is suggested by Sidney Len's account of the event in 1963. One day, watchmen of the San Francisco hydroelectric plant in Brazil were overpowered and handcuffed by armed men who then proceeded to cut telephone wires and to occupy the facilities. In the morning, it was discovered that these were parachutists trained by the U.S. in fighting internal aggression who were staging a mock attack. As it turned out, such tactics did not have to be used when the military seized control of the government the following year. From 1964 through 1972, the U.S. Army sent 27 mobile training teams to Brazil, the Air Force 28, and the Navy 12. A U.S. officer stationed in Brazil in the late 1960s said that, among other missions, these teams assisted in fashioning or reoriented civic action projects in such a way as to serve counterinsurgency goals. He cited, for example, developing the capability for identifying and keeping tabs on persons not native to an area. Other U.S. subsidized programs for training and coordination of defense strategy in the hemisphere include the Inter-American Defense College at Fort McNair, regular joint maneuvers conducted in Latin America and its coastal waters, and the annual Inter-American Army Conference initiated in 1960, which draws together the highest officers of the hemisphere armies. The directorship of the Inter-American Defense College is permanently held in the United States, but the U.S. provides only 25 to 30% of the faculty, the other faculty slots being filled by Latin Americans. One of the Brazilians teaching there in the late 1960s, Colonel Araujo, was the author of the Brazilian Army's Basic Manual on Counterinsurgency in Brazil. It has reportedly served as a Bible for officers involved in the intelligence operations. The nurturing of the Sorbonne group. While top priority in inter-American military cooperation was placed on the production of the hemisphere from external aggression, local military units receiving U.S. grant aid were limited in number. As late as 1960, they constituted no more than 1/6 of the total personnel of the national armed forces in any Latin American country. The shift in priorities in internal security and civic action resulted in a change from the provision of complete support for a fraction of the country's armed forces to the provision of at least a modicum of support to virtually all of the country's military personnel. Until the early 1960s, the preponderant influence of the U.S. military was largely concentrated in a single clique or faction within the Brazilian military. It was the faction that, as the Brazilian Expeditionary Force had fought alongside the U.S. Army 4th Corps in Italy, the primary objective of the U.S. Armed Forces in involving the BEF in the Italian campaign was reportedly the establishment of close ties with the Brazilian military elite and the exposure of that group to the modus operandi of the U.S. military so that it could go back and build up a first-class military organization in Brazil. The BEF, under U.S. tutelage, established and staffed Brazil's Superior War College, the ESG. The book on the BEF, written by its commander, Marshal J. Barcanas de Moraes, suggests something of the limitations of admiration for and sense of camaraderie and identity with the U.S. military developed by that group. Marcanas has noted that with the adoption of U.S. organizations and with war material until then unknown to the Brazilian military, it was natural, not to say logical, to incorporate into our professional teaching heritage regulations and processes of instruction very different from those which we had been used to employing in exercises of that in time of peace. The new regulations adopted in copying the American system included even those relating to discipline and punishment of troops, and the translation of U.S. manuals was undertaken while the war was in progress. Moraes noted finally that the performance of the BEF had been considered magnificent by U.S. military leaders, and that upon their return to Rio de Janeiro, parading through the principal arteries of the metropolitan centers, the 1st EID, Expeditionary Infantry Division, gave the first public presentation of division modeled along U.S. lines. Impressed with the military might of the United States, And with the dynamism of the capitalistic economic system, the faction found the germination of ideas such as non-alignment, economic nationalism, and socialism in post-war Brazil, an ominous development. Such ideas were by no means unrepresented in the Brazilian military in the early 1950s, and economic nationalism remained particularly strong. A dozen general officers of the armed forces, for example, were members of the Centro de Estudo e Defensa e Patrola e da Economica Nacional, which supported the creation of Petrobras. General Euclides Zenobia da Costa, a leader of the BEF, found this development to be a manifestation of the communist infiltration in the military. The military club in Rio de Janeiro had long been considered the weather vane of political trends in the military, the place where factional debates and intrigues were sheltered from public disclosure. In the 1950s, the nationalist state, pro-Vargas and pro-Petrobras, won the elections in the military club, but in 1952, the anti-communist Cruzado Democrático won. For some time, the fortunes of the major military factions and their civilian alliances oscillated. The anti-communist faction, disturbed by what it considered ultranationalism, drove Vargas to suicide in 1954. But its attempts to prevent the inauguration of Kubitschek in 1955 and the accession to the vacated presidency of Goulart in 1961 aborted due to opposition of the military groups. As late as 1962, the pro-Goulart general was narrowly defeated in the elections in the military club, but a number of trends favoring the ascension of the anti-communist faction, by then known because of the association with the ESG as the Sorbonne group, were converging. In particular, while the slavish attachment of the Sorbonne group to the United States and to capitalism was not shared by the majority, the sense of threat to the military institution was in the generalized acceptance of internal warfare, as the mission of the military meant that the enemy could only be potential civilian allies of the more nationalistic officers. Ahead of this, Alfred Stepan found that the variables distinguishing the core group of conspirators against Goulart and backers of the Castelo Branco government from the other active duty line generals in 1964, the most salient were participation in the BEF, membership on the permanent staff of the ESG, attendance at foreign, mostly U.S. schools, graduation as number one in the class of the three major Army schools, and membership in the technically most advanced branch of the Army. We have seen that in the period since World War II, the U.S. military had displaced European military establishment as the major source of both material assistance and training for the Brazilian armed forces. In fact, the organizational links between the U.S. and Brazilian armed forces were so direct and comprehensive that officers of both countries spoke of their military alliance as a quote-unquote special relationship. Through its Army many training programs for Latin American officers, the U.S. military had exposed Brazilian officers to its own concepts of the expanding role of the military in international politics and of the challenges and threats to the military in Latin America. There has indeed emerged in Brazil a generation of U.S.-trained, technocratically oriented officers, among whom one faction in particular had come to look upon the U.S. Armed Forces as the reference group by which it could measure its own achievement and to which it could look for approval. It was that faction, the so-called Sorbonne group, that spearheaded the coup of 1964. The following chapters focus in greater detail on the argument that the support of association with the training of the U.S. military reinforced the anti-democratic biases of the Brazilian military elite. So that's chapter 9. A good summary chapter. I'm going to just go over, some of the things that I noted in that chapter. The first thing that I noted in the chapter was the French. The French were displaced, and the professionalism of the French officers came to my view. The French officers had been displaced by the U.S. Army. When the U.S. came in, the French officers were pushed out, but they were describing professionalism. They were describing how to be professional. That's the typical thing. The U.S. government, it's racist fraud whites of the U.S. government. It's brutal military people, push out, non-professional action, just racist murder and racist torture is the approach to deal with other people. The next thing I noticed was the racial purity issue, how to deal with natives. There was one thing specifically on, if the racial characteristic enlisted men were to be indoctrinated prior to landing in the racial characteristics of the target country, including whether those characteristics incline the natives to be corrupt, excitable, superstitious, vacillating, or susceptible to propaganda. They were instructed also that if the country had a high illiteracy rate, its inhabitants tended to be childlike. So the manual, this is the manual of the Marines. The manual was, the Marines had a manual. It's called Free and Fair Elections. There was a manual by the Marines. It's not, actually listed, the lessons of Marines. The manual. Okay, the Marine Corps Small Wars Manual, published in 1940, described racial characteristics as, what kinds of people they are. These are racist white murderers, war criminal, murderous, genocidal butcher whites. And that is what they learn. And this kind of racial characteristics and racial profiling is where the U.S. police comes in as well. The U.S. police is a racially brutal group of whites that, profile people, maybe specifically on small, designations of racial purity, including like whether the characteristics are colored, black, brown, white, all of these things, like, what kind of, background they have. Are they Asian? Are they Hispanic? Are they black? Are they African? Those sorts of things come up. Excuse me. So the police brutality, the white police brutality, takes the profiling of the racial purity manual of the Marine Corps Small Wars Manual, and then describes the brutality that they're allowed to use, and profiling people. And then if they're if they're illiterate, they are excuse me. If they're illiterate, they are childlike. The racist white brutal police officers, the terrorist American police whites are childlike if they are if the people are, certain characters, they have certain characteristics. So this goes along with the racist white, murderous butchers, the genocidal butchers, like father, like son, like their President Johnson. The police brutal racist murderers are the same. So continuing on, we learned about the Panama School. The Panama School, called the training complex, was the School of the Americas Army at Fort Gulick, and then multiple Air Force and all different Air Force. The Inter-American Air Force Academy at Albrook Air Force Base, the smaller Inter-American Geodetic Survey at Fort Clayton, and, additional jungle schools. So this was called the coup d'etat school, the school to teach the Latin Americans how to engage in a coup. Another racist group of white frauds, white liars, propagandists, frauds. They're going to Latin America and instituting courses to induce the overthrow of the government by a military right-wing dictatorship that murders its people. This is the U.S. government, the white racist, genocidal, murderous butchers. So that's, that was one aspect of it. And then finally, we saw the training programs, the different training programs were given. And the Sorbonne group. The Sorbonne group was the coup d'etat, the generals that were involved in the coup of General Goulart. They were all picked from the Sorbonne group because they were all trained in U.S. training schools. So all of this went back to the training of the U.S. Brazilian military generals, many of which were done in the United States, but some were also done in Pan American school, and they all were used to, make the military generals anti-democratic bias. They were used to, capture the anti-democratic biases of the Brazilian general. This is the obvious thing. The racist whites of Washington, anti-democratic, colonial, fascist regimes that they institute due to their fascist biases and anti-democratic squashings. They are racist, white murderers, brutal whites of the United States of America. So continuing on, the institutional ambient use of the military. It has been that Defense Secretary McNamara argued in 1962 that training by the U.S. military would expose Latin American officers to democracy at work. One of the most fundamental questions suggested by McNamara's means ends juxtaposition is whether or not the military is an appropriate institution for the teaching and exhibition of democracy. It was assumed in his statement that the experience of the U.S. officer corps was that of living and participating in, thus presumably understanding and valuing a democratic system. While the U.S. political tradition may be democratic, and that, of course, is a matter of degree, the immense political environment of these officers is that of the military establishment, and the military is the antithesis of the democratic institution. It is argued in this chapter that as a consequence of the nature of the institution and of the mentality that it spawns, the exposure of Brazilian officers to the U.S. military establishment would be more likely to reinforce authoritarian biases than to engender democratic ones. In the view of one disillusioned officer, Lieutenant Colonel Edward L. King, those 20 years in the service, including experience in Latin America, Europe, Korea, Vietnam, and on the staff of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Army structure is permeated by fear. Only lip service is paid to the concepts of justice, equality, and constitutionally guaranteed freedom for members. Any deviation from the rules, the basic criticism of the system, is swiftly and ruthlessly punished. Furthermore, King perceived among U.S. officers a growing sense of being in an adversary relationship to those outside the Army system. Those on the outside are frequently viewed as the enemy by those in the Army. In the minds of many officers, there is the incontrovertible conviction that theirs is the ultimate patriotism. Consequently, they are able to rationalize all their acts as patriotic. No matter how self-serving, it is easy for the ultimate patriots, well-intentioned as they may be, to act in a repressive or vindictive manner toward the people who do not agree with their definition of patriotism and what they believe best for the country. Brazilian journalist Alvaro Pereira, analyzing the philosophical and institutional biases of the political behavior of the so-called Sorbonne group in Brazil, saw nothing of the flamboyant caudillismo that, at least from the U.S. point of view, has stereotyped Latin American militarism. Rather, he largely attributes the political orientation of the Castelo Branco and his colleagues to the bureaucratic ethos, or as institutionalized phenomena characteristic of military establishments generally. What distinguishes this relationship among persons or groups, according to Ferreira, is that it makes little difference to the one who gives orders whether they are obeyed because they are believed to be beneficent or because disciplinary sanction is feared. While the bureaucratic ethos is not exclusive to the military, it is intensified within the military, especially at the professional level, because institutional directives govern the overall life of the individual, not merely his conduct during the workday. Furthermore, gains and losses are reckoned not in terms solely of material things, but in terms of human life. It is rarely questioned axiom that the life of the individual may hinge on obedience and that it is ultimately dependent upon success of the institution. The ease with which this orientation to the stakes of competition can be transferred to the political arena was indicated by General Alexander Haig, communicating upon how much at home he felt that the new job as Chief of Staff to President Nixon. Politics and soldiering are very, very close. It is a field where a man lays everything on the line to win or lose. When one doesn't win, the results are fatal. In the case of military, quite fatal. While the Brazilian military has become an increasingly middle class rather than upper class institution since World War II, recruitment from the lower class has significantly decreased during the same period. Along with class homogeneity, institutional characteristics have apparently been rendered even more salient by a high degree of nepotism. The files of the Brazilian Army Academy, Academia Militar de Agulhas Negras, reveals that sons of the career military men represented 21.2% of cadets entering in 1941 to 1943 and 34.9% in 1962 to 1966. By 1966, they represented more than 40%. Sons of career military men could attend the high school academies tuition free, whereas offspring of civilians had to pay and could only attend if there were extra places. By 1939, 61.6% of the cadets entering the military academy had attended civilian high schools. But by 1962 to 1966 period, that figure had dropped to 7.6%. Up to 90% of the contemporary generation of Army officers entered the military academic system at about the age of 12. Stepan found that the sons of military officers were overrepresented among the general officers plotting to overthrow the Goulart government in 1964 and concluded that increasing self-recruitment coupled with the intensification of the military educational programs were undoubtedly factors in the growing corporate consciousness of the military and their loosening of links with civilians in the period leading up to and after the seizure of power in 1964. After a spurt of optimism in the early 1960s that the integration of the middle and, to a lesser extent, the lower classes into the Latin American military establishments would mitigate anti-democratic tendencies, many scholars have concluded that institutional characteristics tend to outweigh such factors in determining the behavior of the military. Eric Nordinger, for example, has maintained that military values and corporate interests attach overriding importance to a kind of stability characterized by a strict observance of hierarchical authority and a supposedly apolitical calm. And Miles Wolpin noted that these values engender apathetic dispositions to political demonstration strikes and the uncertainties associated with redistributed political conflict. Others have suggested that political debate and open competition for popular support are seen by the military as intrusions in a decision-making process that should be characterized by unity and consensus. This theme finds expression in the, quote, message of the revolutionary junta to the Argentine people, released to the press at the time of the overthrow of civilian President Arturo Illia in 1966. It condemned the fallacy of a formal and sterile legality which in the name of liberty and electoral freedom had fostered a vote-seeking system that divided the country and mocked true democracy. The announcement concluded with an exhortation to unity. In a similar vein, President Medici, in a speech to the nation on the 9th anniversary of the Brazilian Revolution, boasted, uniformity in thought and actions is the principal reason for the speed and efficiency with which our country has being modernized, and the bonds of solidarity between Brazilians are being forged. And the Chilean ambassador to the United States in March 1974, in response to a question about elections, said that the trouble with the politicians is that they make politics instead of governing, that they just set out one group against another. And he asserted, at this moment, we have no time for politics. We have to rebuild the country. Likewise, the concept of good government espoused by the ESG calls not for the resolution of discord, but for the elimination of it. National security, an ESG lecture explained in 1973, is the complete functionalism of essential matters for which the human collectivity directly or indirectly lays claim, preserved for it through its respective state. Functionalism implies the elimination of dangers, antagonisms, and pressures that confronts the nation. He defined internal security as the social, political, economic, juridical, cultural state that results from the normal functioning of the essential matters in the ambit of the national community. Functional normality means the removal of antagonism, pressures, and opposition to appreciable form and a punishable antagonism. He explained, in the words of a former permanent staff member of the school, is an attitude of willful dispute of the national objectives as set forth presumably by the ESG. Such an attitude is not to be confused, he said, with the simple democratic opposition. Since the security of the nation is presumed to be dependent upon the efficiency of the military, national security is seen first of all in terms of the security of the military as an institution, at least as it applies to Latin America. U.S. military officers appear to be in overwhelming agreement with this point of view. Lieutenant General Alva Fitch, Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, appearing before the Subcommittee on Inter-American Affairs of the House Committee of Foreign Affairs on February 25, 1965, maintained that during the long interim period before these goals, solution of economic and social problems and evolution of stable democracy can be obtained, the security forces of individual countries will remain the major obstacle in the communist seizures of power. Captain Raymond Toner, chief of the Naval Mission and naval advisor to the Ecuadorian Ministry of Defense and commander of the U.S. Naval Station in San Juan during both the Cuban quarantine and the Dominican intervention, asserted in 1968 that all of the instruments of power, the military still remains the most powerful and possesses the great capability of maintain stability against pressures from within and without. But Southcon Commander General Porter was warned that one main communist objective is to discredit and eventually destroy the Latin American armed forces. To this end, a persistent communist tactic is to belittle the Latin American military man. From Porter's perspective, then, criticism of the military is likely to be a manifestation of the communist conspiracy and a threat to national security. In his report on the official investigation of communism and corruption of the Goulart administration conducted after the coup, Colonel Ferdinando del Carvalho charged the communists with multiple sins against the armed forces, undermining of hierarchy and discipline, inadequate promotions, and deficient remuneration, characterization of a supposed militarism with totalitarian and retrograde traits, and weakening the military spirit by employing the armed forces in missions of secondary importance and ones which, in general, were incompatible with the characteristics and equipment of military organizations. Ironically, it is not all unlikely that the last item in this series referred to certain aspects of civic action. Likewise, students at the ESG were in 1973 were being admonished to be on guard against criticism of the military. They were warned that even a developed state that allowed itself to become excessively penetrated by pacifism, liberalism, and anti-militarism would find itself unprepared to meet external or internal challenges. Ferreira argued that the manner in which the Brazilian political parties were reorganized by the Castelo Branco regime reflects the bureaucratic military vision of the political process, not as an adjustment of conflict, but rather as an exercise in unity and order. U.S. Lieutenant Colonel Lyle Stockton, who in 1967 analyzed the revolutionary military government of Brazil, apparently shared this orientation of the political process, and perhaps because his own immediate environment in U.S. society was that of the military, he saw the U.S. political process as such an exercise. Stockton wrote, "The author views the acts and decrees, first and second institutional acts and presidential decrees, as an effort to emulate the political system of the United States. It was, in all probability, the most expeditious and easy way to do it. The fact that President Branco retained Congress and forced the country into a two-party system refutes those who cry dictatorship. He has been arbitrary, but how else could he affix political responsibilities with the party loyalty and discipline? The new Constitution gives the president very strong and broad powers, and he does not necessarily have to use them. The author views these powers as a necessary reserve force, which measures the president can foster the growth of a strong two-party political system operating around a sound representative government on a sound fiscal basis." Colonel Milton Calero, U.S. Army attaché in Brasilia, from 1968 through 1970 has maintained that Brazilian officers trained in the United States are particularly impressed by the material progress and order there. At House Foreign Affairs Committee hearings in 1970, Representative Vernon Thompson was told by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, G. Warren Nutter, that trainees were being effectively exposed to the democratic process. Thompson inquired how they were receiving such an exposure in military camps and bases. Secretary Nutter replied, "We have a program of orientation tours through which we achieve the kind of exposure that we want them to have," italics added, "to the way the American system works." Some 85% of the Brazilian trained in the United States have been beneficiaries of these orientation tours. At first glance, the tours would appear to be ordinary junketeering, relatively harmless except as another drain on hard-pressed U.S. taxpayers. But a perusal of more than 1,000 items on the itineraries of 13 tours for graduates of the ESG, the Army and Air Force Command and General Staff colleges, and the Naval War Colleges suggests that what is being exposed is hardly democracy at work, but rather the power and opulence of the U.S. military. The country is portrayed as a military picnic to which the multinational corporations have been invited. Aside from straight entertainment excursions of the Disneyland variety, almost all items refer to visits to military installations and factories or social events hosted by the U.S. military or U.S. corporations or U.S. businessmen associations. Not a single legislative or deliberative body was included, and about the only places where the trainees might have observed open expression of political dissent were a couple of non-military universities. Secretary Nutter added that an informational program provided trainees with important information on the nature of governmental institutions, political parties, and so on in the United States. Some recent guides for trainees have mentioned anti-war protests in the United States, linking them to communism, but for the most part, the system describes it is a consensual one in which, for example, there are no fundamental differences between the two parties. And the loyal opposition provided by the two-party system in the United States is contrasted with the ideologic parties of underdeveloped countries, which make a competitive party system undesirable. As for the exposure of trainees to the Canal Zone, Alfred Steppen pointed out in the above-mentioned 1970 hearings that the atmosphere and style of U.S. citizens within the Canal Zone, and especially the sense of their different social and economic status vis-a-vis Panamanians, leave one with an overall impression of U.S. colonialism. Calero mentioned technical know-how as one of the main things Brazilian officers hope to gain through U.S. training and association with their U.S. counterparts. Brady Tyson saw this fixation on technological advancement as an important factor distinguishing the modern variety of militarism in Latin America, and in Brazil in particular, from earlier ones. Tyson viewed the regimes of the militochnocrats as manifestations less of a distinctive ideology than of a distinctive mentality, which assumes that there are managerial and technological solutions to a political and social problems. Whether or not this mentality, quote unquote, was to some extent acquired through association with the U.S. military, it certainly appears to be shared by the U.S. officers who have been closely associated with the Brazilian counterparts. General Robert Seitz, chairman of the U.S. delegation of the JBU-SMC in the late 1960s, told the author that he was not entirely convinced that a communist takeover was imminent in 1964, but he felt that the coup was necessary anyway for the purpose of stemming corruption and inflation. He saw in the Brazilian political system from the end of World War II until 1964 a pattern of progressive deterioration. The situation was chaotic from 1945 until the election of Kubitschek. His rule turned out to be nothing but corruption. Quadro's harebrained ideas, like decorating Cubans when they were being sanctioned elsewhere, made a military coup inevitable, and the rebellion of non-commissioned officers indicate that Goulart was bent on taking over the military. Seitz could hardly contain his enthusiasm for what the revolutionary government had accomplished. He attributed the success in part to the fact that the military is immune to political pressures and political favoritism, and that with the military backing, policymakers are not subject to pressures from political constituencies. He doubted the economic miracle, quote unquote, and social advances that could be achieved by a civilian government, as the political pressures would have been too great. The eradication of the favelas around Rio de Janeiro would have been difficult, for example, because the favela dwellers had to be relocated in their new island housing by force, inland housing by force. Seitz said that even though there was greater efficiency in dictatorship, he hoped that the government would be turned into a civilian in 1974. He said that by the time a decade would have passed since the coup, he said that by that time the decade would have passed since the coup, and that ample time would have been allowed for the military to have gotten the government on the right course. Seitz wondered, however, whether by the time civilians would have come along, who could control the systems. While this mentality is particularly pronounced in modern military establishments, it is by no means confined to them. Celso Furtado has said that it was shared by the industrialists who attended the ESG and viewed by the Brazilian government as a military operation in which men are mere pawns. Predicted, it will make little difference whether those who govern us tomorrow are military or civilian as a professional condition. The fact is that it will be a military and bureaucratic mentality that guides the Brazilian process from now on. We have seen that the U.S. military training programs that are purported to offer exposure to democracy at work, quote unquote, have been more often exposed participants to power and opulence of the U.S. military, rather than stressing its submission to civilian authority and to a military bureaucratic view of politics as an orderly, consensual process in which there is little room for genuine debate and competition. The projection of the decision-making norm that guides a single institution as the norm should guide national societies has been encouraged by the view that the national security resides within that institution. It has been encouraged, as we shall see in the next chapter, by the Cold War worldview. So that's chapter 10, the institutionalization ambient of the military. Pretty straightforward chapter. We can see the U.S. government, the white, murderous, genocidal frauds, the genocidal proportions, the brutality of their police, all of that stuff, their white, murderous police brutality and their racial profiling, all of that was discussed in the prior chapter. In this chapter, we discuss specifically the fact that the U.S., military, mindset was, about forget the political process. They are not into debate. They are not into discussions. They are into, racist murder and racist, theft of money. They do not care about discussing things. What is right or wrong to Washington politicians and bureaucrats? It's U.S. Congress murderers. We make the rules and we're the white man. That's their approach to everyone. They are a group of mafia, murderous, genocidal, war criminal, butcher, and, gangsters. And that's what they do. They just make the rules. And so you saw that, the military establishment is unable to accept democracy. They are unable to accept a discussion and debate about what is the civilian way forward. A civilian government reflects the values of the people. The people of the land decide what happens in a civilian government. A military government is a machine gun type government. It is holding the civilians hostage at the butt of the American machine guns. And that is what the United States love. It loves to foster fascism, white supremacy, fascism, racism, and at the machine gun government type military dictatorship. And that is what eventually ended up. And we see the last sentence, I'm going to read the last couple sentences. We have seen that the U.S. military training programs have purported to offer exposure to democracy at work, have more often exposed participants to the power and opulence of the U.S. military, rather than stressing the view of submission to civilian authority and to a military bureaucratic view of politics as an orderly consensual process in which there is little room for genuine debate and competition. So no debate, no competition, just fascist, racist, white, murderous, butcher frauds of the U.S. Congress and its, police and brutal institutions of, fascist dictatorship. That is what the United States is. Brutal institutions of fascist dictatorship. So continuing on, implications of the Cold War worldview. Last chapter, chapter 11. It's about 12 pages. We should be done. The assumptions that democratic values would be imparted through training and other contacts with U.S. officers presuppose that those officers advocated civilian supremacy generally and for Latin America in particular, and that the political indoctrination in the training program reflected that bias. The content of the political indoctrination, however, derived overwhelmingly from the Cold War worldview. This chapter will deal with some of the ways in which the Cold War worldview encouraged Brazilian officers to view their own role as encompassing the control and direction and all aspects of national life. Lieutenant General Alva R. Fitch reported to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in 1965. From the United States point of view, the military forces in Latin America are ideologically well equipped for their crucial role. Throughout the area, the officer corps are anti-communist, anti-Castro, and friendly toward the United States. Anti-communism in itself hardly constitutes an ideology, implanted as an absolute rather than a relative value. However, it does have far-reaching implications. When Talleyrand stated that the war was too important a matter to be left to the generals, the assumption was that the military affairs were an extension of political affairs. The war-making and war-makers were to be governed by the larger political process. With the Cold War worldview, that order is reversed. The political process itself, of both the national and international levels, becomes an instrument in a perpetual global war that is too important to be left to civilians. As was true of the United States military, the assumption by the military in Brazil that it had a role to play in internal security evolved in the 19th century out of attempts to subdue or eliminate the indigenous population. The skirmishes within the caboches of Canudos in the 1890s, according to Frederick Nunn, at once vindicated the Brazilian army's existence and made it look pitiful, as it was ill-prepared for such tasks. The Brazilian military had also early and extensive experience with projects such as road building, which later were to be categorized as civic actions. Furthermore, general training of Brazilian officers prior to World War I and French training of the period between the wars had instilled some of the concepts of military professionalism that remained pronounced in the 1960s. As early as 1913, a military journal edited by Germanophilic officers proclaimed that the army was the only truly organized force in the midst of an amorphous mass of ferment and a decisive factor in the political change or social stability. In an interwar years, the highly politicized French army imparted to the Brazilian officer corps some of the experience it had gained in colonial administration. But it was ultimately the U.S. military with its Cold War worldview that provided the Brazilians with a rationale or legitimation for reviving and refining internal security doctrine and using it as a weapon against political opponents, for expanding the concept of civic action from road building to nation building, for assuming a permanent role of professional political elite, and for implanting a colonial regime on their own turf. In the condemnation of torture in Brazil in 1970, the International Commission of Jurists pointed out that since the second military coup of 1968, the Brazilian government has adopted the policy of subversive war. Brazilian officers have learned such methods from American experts and theoreticians whom they meet in great numbers, either in their own military schools in Brazil or during regular training courses in the Panama Canal Zone. And Manfred Cossack saw the Praetorian function characteristic of Latin American armed forces, the primacy of internal over external or defense functions, which attains the most extreme form with the de facto function of the state, military and police powers, as having been determined since 1961 to 1962 by an orientation toward the anti-subversive preventive war. So Praetorian function is Pretoria, that is South Africa, the South African approach to military and state police terror he is referring to. Although the French had extensive experience in counterinsurgency in the 1950s and 1960s, their experience was transmitted to Latin America through the intermediary of the U.S. military. The most significant contribution of European advisors to Latin American military doctrine was the transplantation of balance of power theories and strategies, including emphasis on the protection of borders and the avoidance of permanent alliances. U.S. training after World War II stressed the necessity of a permanent alliance in the face of a permanent war, and as General Robert Seitz remarked in 1973, in an interview with the author, it provided the impetus in the early 1950s for a focus on nation building, bringing civilians to remote areas. More importantly, however, as Colonel DeForest Ballou explains it, the U.S. military tried to focus the attention of Brazilian officers on external enemies. That is, the Brazilians were being told to view their own compatriots who differed from them politically as the external enemies. Even though we were talking about counterinsurgency, the focus is external. We try to tell them your real worry is not the guys next door, neighboring countries, but insurgents. Furtado said that by early 1960s, Brazilian military schools, libraries, and clubs were saturated with U.S. military journals and technical papers projecting internal security doctrine, and this doctrine was thoroughly absorbed by Brazilian officers. It was thoroughly absorbed by Brazilian officers. The 1962 article in the official U.S. Army Information Digest proclaimed that counterinsurgency includes all military, political, economic, and socio-psychological activities directed towards preventing and supporting resistance groups, civil affairs, intelligence, psychological warfare, engineer, medical, signal, transportation, and other Army units can be used to enhance the stature of local military forces by training them to undertake civic action or nation-building tasks. A revision of the U.S. Army's basic doctrinal manual, published in the same year, had much in common with the Marine Corps Small Wars Manual of 1940. The Army Manual noted that the stability and law and order are essential to the success of Cold War efforts and urged the maximum use of indigenous forces and personnel to achieve these ends. But it also observed that U.S. land forces in overseas areas are a real and viable deterrent. In situations short of war, it envisaged any or all of the following goals: encouragement of a weak and faltering government, stabilization of a restless area, deterrence or actual thwarting of aggression, reinforcement of a threatened area, checking or counterinsurgency, countering aggressive moves by some hostile power, maintenance and restoration of order, and asserted that the U.S. Armed Forces must support both military and non-military programs of the United States and its allies. As a decade of the 1960s wore on, the humiliation of the U.S. military in Vietnam appeared to enhance rather than discredit these doctrines. A training manual on internal defense in use at Fort Leavenworth, among other places in the early 1970s, opens with this admonition. Defining war as an extension of politics is virtually unquestioned to the modern age, inverting the relationship to conclude that politics is also an extension of conflict could be considered as an even more accurate definition of the ideologic struggles as executed in the contemporary world arena. Since the mid-1960s, the relative parity of destruction potential held by the superpowers has encouraged war by proxy, most commonly assuming the form of insurgencies fought in the lesser developed areas of the world. This form of struggle is waged with a totality never before experienced in human history, a totality that encompasses all elements of population and all aspects of life, to include the thinking as well as the activities of society. A 1968 manual entitled Psychological Operations, U.S. Army Doctrine, explains that U.S. Army stability operations include tactical intelligence, psychological, civil affairs, advisory assistance, and populace and resources control. Psychological operations are designed to gain, preserve, and strengthen civilian support for the host government and its stability operations, as well as to establish and maintain a suitable image of the U.S. elements supporting the host country. Meanwhile, they seek to create dissension, dissatisfaction, and defection among insurgent forces. Unconventional warfare operations are even more ambitious. They seek to influence ideologic, religious, psychological, political, economic, and social factors which promote intense emotional partisanship. It is not surprising then, considering what was being presented as within the scope of military responsibility, that General Seats found that the officers exposed to U.S. training have a chance to establish more challenging goals and to develop broader perspectives. Colonel Edward King, representative of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the Joint Brazil-U.S. Defense Commission, also saw among the U.S. trained officers a new wave of intellectualism inspired in part by the large number of U.S. officers seeking advanced degrees and manifested in an expansion of the definition of the military role to include many aspects of the art of governing. General Seats claimed in 1973 that the entire military educational systems in Brazil was a mirror of that of the United States. Major General J. Bina Machado, Vice Chief of Staff of the Brazilian Army in 1970 and a former commandant of the Army Command and General Staff School, describes the transformation of that school as a consequence of the increased exposure of Brazilian officers to their U.S. counterparts. From the experience of the Brazilian Expeditionary Force in Italy during World War II, it became apparent that the influx of new ideas and equipment necessitated a revision of the instructions and organization of the ECEME. Thus began the period of influence of U.S. military ideas. Today, the study of military doctrine of various countries, especially that of the United States, continues. The school is constantly striving to adapt the experience of others to the conditions peculiar to Brazil. The fight against communist revolutionary activities and subversion has been provided invaluable experience in that particular field. Within the highly developed educational complex of the Brazilian Armed Forces, the ESG remains the most prestigious school and the one most self-consciously engaged in the recruitment and preparation of the ruling elite. By 1965, all generals on active duty had passed through the school, and the professional officers had taken upon themselves the task of professionalizing select elements of the civilian sector, particularly the industrialists. About half the school's graduates were civilians. The rationale for the creation of the school, as expressed in a 1949 document, was that national security was a function of the general power of the nation, and that the armed forces, as the institution responsible for national security, were obligated to intervene in order to develop the general power of the nation. A lecturer at the ESG in 1956 declared, "We live in a climate of worldwide war that will decide the destiny of Western civilization," and he added that periods of war demand a centralized and hierarchic structure. At least 5 years before the revolution, very specific plans for restructuring the political system were being discussed at the ESG. In 1963, the ESG was describing its mission as that of preparing its students to perform executive and advisory function, especially in those organs responsible for the formulation, development, planning, and execution of the policies of national security. And the school's academic divisions suggested the scope of their concept of national security. The divisions encompass political affairs, psychological affairs, psychosocial affairs, economic affairs, military affairs, logistic and mobilizational affairs, intelligence and counterintelligence, and doctrine and coordination. So that is the ECME, the Army Command and General Staff School of the Brazilian Army, formed in 1970. In a press conference on May 14, 1964, President Castelo Branco said that although the ESG was not the driving force behind the revolution, the school had an extraordinary influence on those who had participated in it and had formed the revolutionary government. In particular, he said, all those who passed through the school became convinced that practical solutions to national problems should be completely divorced from the partisan interest. Furthermore, he said, they had learned to work as a team, and they had a global perspective and a broad understanding of the problems of national security. General Augusto Fragoso, director of the ESG in 1970, described the mission and the major contribution of the school as the formation of the national elite, through methodologically preparing year after year military officers and civilians of the highest intellectual and moral rank for the functions of planning and directing the national security in the sense in which we have always understood it, involving directly or indirectly all the activities of the nation. Fragoso maintained that the masses lack a critical time and space, and that the national elites, the authentic elites of the global society, must not and cannot escape the mission of directing the political community. The identity of external internal enemy so threatening as to require the military to expand the area of domestic concerns was suggested by General William Westmoreland, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, addressing the Eighth Conference of American Armies in Rio de Janeiro in September 1968. He warned, one only needs to read his newspaper to know that the communists have used insurgent warfare throughout the world with varying degrees of success. I feel that the prospects of repeated Vietnams around the world present a very real danger to the security of every freedom-loving people. The propaganda describing each insurgency will picture what they term as an oppressed people rising to overthrow the alleged oppressor. The world has been dissatisfied people from the communists who can exploit in their quest for destruction of free society. He refers to the Westmoreland automated murder machine of Westmoreland, the racist white war criminal of the U.S. Army. Francis Folan said of the Sorbonne group that their Cold War psychology and U.S. orientation conjured up a communist behind every plea for reform, and a positivist trait confirmed their belief that only they, as technocrats, immune to the vagaries of civilian politics, could discipline the economy and the populace so as to achieve the essential economic development. Frederick Nunn observed that subject to the United States military influence on anti-communism, the professional army officer became hostile to any sort of populism. Celso Furtado pointed out that the Brazilian military's close association and identification with U.S. officers enhanced its sense of importance of its own role and contributed to its own alienation from liberal and populist civilian political leaders. And Thomas Skidmore maintained that the pervasive anti-communism of the ESG fostered contempt for all civilian politicians. The perception of attitude of being engaged in internal warfare continued to grow and intensify, and therefore to become, to some extent, a self-fulfilling prophecy among the Brazilian ruling circles as well as among their U.S. military advisors. After 1964, those compatriot civilians and even dissident military officers who had been viewed in previous decades as political opponents became cast in the dehumanized image of an alien military enemy. By the late 1960s, the image had been projected upon virtually anyone whose ideologic conformity was subject to question. In 1969, a Brazilian intelligence officer confided in Newsweek Rio station chief Peter Kramer. In our view, there are two basic things to remember when considering the question of torture. The first is that we are at war, a war of subversion, and that these people are the enemy. If they got to power, it won't be torture and a prison term for us, but death from bullets in the back. The other thing is that a person with an ideology doesn't give information as a gift. In 1971, General Humberto de Souza Melo, commander of the Second Army stationed in Sao Paulo, warned that the threat of Latin American subversion will have deep and grave repercussions for all America, and Brazil, with its geographic position and style of life, will be the main target of the communist attack. He added the communist monsters taking advantage of the inexperienced youth to spread anarchy and to subvert the moral tradition, character, and religious patterns. General Breno Borges Fortes, commander of the Army General Staff, told his new generals in April 1973, the most tragic error we could make at the present moment would be to conclude that the problem of communism had been overcome. It exists and is always present, whatever the level of the development reached by the country. Anti-communism, of course, is a negative, the opposite of which can only be anything but. But many of the U.S. officers have dealt with this by simply assuming, or at least asserting, that the opposite is democracy. The assumption is often bolstered by an inability or unwillingness to distinguish between rhetoric or trappings and substance. Captain Toner, for example, asserted in 1968 that all the Latin American countries except Cuba are democracies under a republican form of government. Others have maintained that the danger of communist takeovers in virtually all of the Latin American countries is so great, and the eventuality of another communist victory in the hemisphere so unthinkable, that the only kind of democracy can be tolerated is that imposed and controlled from above, presumably by the military. Major Douglas Weirs wrote in 1967, with one communist country in our hemisphere, can we afford to allow even a possibility of another one? Of the Brazilian Revolution, he said, Castelo Branco has been determined to re-democratize Brazil, but according to his own plans, he has ruled primarily by decrees and regulations. The Constitution and methods used are not democratic in our sense of the word, but they are effective and were necessary in order to stop the trend toward communism and disaster which the Goulart regime was following. Lieutenant Commander Dayton Hayne, also writing in 1967, asserted, it is generally accepted that Brazil was at the brink of total chaos, was ripe for a communist coup. It was subsequently discovered that a communist coup had been planned for a month later. Han therefore concluded the Brazilian military desires a strong, capable constitutional and democratic government, but if the civilian politicians can provide this type of government, the Brazilian armed forces will take action which they deem appropriate to achieve their desires. In a lecture at the U.S. Naval War College in 1967, Lyman B. Kirkpatrick, former CIA executive, said that the communists are a powerful and potentially dangerous force in nearly all of Latin America. And in 1968, Captain Toner wrote, communist-directed sources of internal disorder are reaching into the unions, the universities, and the teeming slums that surround all of the major Latin American cities. For the foreseeable future, there will probably be no decrease in communist-inspired wars of liberation, with concomitant guerrilla warfare requiring continued counterinsurgency operations by the Latin American military. Toner further stated, as is the case with all other military forces, the Latin American military today performs two major roles. The exterior role is the traditional role of the military as a balance of forces to protect the nation from aggression or a threat to the vital interests. Its interior role is the performance of these duties, which may significantly affect the organization and functioning of the administration of the government and its traditional economy. In defense of the Military Assistance Program, Assistant Secretary of Defense Warren Nutter pointed out at the 1969 Senate hearings that the instance of illegal and unscheduled changes of heads of state was decreasing over the long term. In the period between 1930 and 1939, there were 35 from 1940 to 1949, 28 from 1950 to 59, 29, and from 1960 to 1969, only 18. What he failed to note, however, was that the majority of the unscheduled changes in the 1950s were in the direction of deposing dictators. Needler listed only 3 of the Latin American governments in 1961 as dictatorships. The direction of irregularities in the 1960s and 1970s was predominantly the reverse, that is, the demise of civilians, constitutional regimes. By mid-1976, there were only 4 Latin American governments that were not generally regarded as dictatorships. Furthermore, it might have been explained that toleration of elitist authoritarian governments and the prevalence of palace coups as the means of presidential succession would have been reduced as political infrastructure became more complex and as the ranks of the politically articulate were swelled. The rise and maintenance of authoritarian rule has increasingly called for encompassing pacification and for ever greater sophistication in organization, strategy, weaponry, and technology. The traditional role of military establishments in most Latin American countries suggests that their predilection to maintain at least a veto power over civilian authorities and their policies owes little or nothing to the prodding of their U.S. counterparts. However, the Cold War worldview, so assiduously marketed by the United States, has provided not only the justification that the authoritarian rulers present to their own people, but also the justification presented to the U.S. taxpayer for his provision of material, technical, and political support for the modernization of the mechanisms of repression. Argentine writer Rogelio Garcia Lupo saw the anti-communism of the Brazilian generals as a tactic to tip the continental balance of power in Brazil's favor. He noted the flexibility, the pro-Nazi Brazilian generals of the 30s who sent troops to Naples to fight for the Allies in the 40s became leftists in the 50s and are today characteristic of anti-communism. The versatility, Garcia Lupo says, is only a tactical one. The gyrations of the Brazilian generals are not based on ideology or conviction. Their strategy rests on so unromantic a foundation as geopolitics. The observation appears in an article he wrote in 1965. General Golbery Couto e Silva, chief of military intelligence in Rio de Janeiro, is now circulating mimeographed copies of a position paper among the officers in the War College. Its thesis is quite simple. The U.S. will put all of South America under the tutelage of Brazil in the same way that Great Britain handed domination of the hemisphere over to the U.S. in the 19th century. There is only one condition: that Brazil take on the role of Washington's leading satellite in return for some rewards. We have seen that the Cold War worldview, toward which foreign officers exposed to U.S. military programs were being proselytized, encouraged those officers to view their own countrymen who advocated redistribution as agents or dupes of an external military enemy. The war against that enemy was portrayed as total, global, and permanent. It followed that the military establishment was under obligation to maintain control over all aspects of national life in order to maintain national security. It is not suggested that those Brazilian officers who have governed their country for the past decade were lacking in self-motivation or were unwilling converts to the Cold War worldview. On the contrary, it appears that they grasped it enthusiastically and proceeded to refine it to meet their precise needs. It is suggested, however, that this worldview and the fact that it was being marketed by the world's greatest military power provided them the justification and legitimation required for pursuing their own sweeping ambitions. Some of the implications of this worldview for the policies and operations of the U.S. military are elaborated in the next chapter. So that's, again, I believe that's chapter 10, implications of the Cold War worldview. Chapter 11, implications of the Cold War worldview. So let's just make a few comments here. Basically, the U.S. government, its military, attache, the military approach was, basically ideological indoctrination. They ideologically indoctrinated the Brazilian, military generals with, an authoritarian feeling of you have to subordinate civilian governments. Everything in this chapter indicates the U.S. lack of respect for democratic institutions. It is a group of white, mafia gangster, war criminal butchers. They just all of a sudden, just adopt a military policy where at the butt of a machine gun, you listen to us. And, if you don't listen to us, we shoot to kill, or we kill your family, or we imprison you. That's their approach, the gun-violent, murderous butchers of the U.S. government. So that is one aspect. Many of the other aspects, the ESG, we talked about the ECEME, the Army Command and General Staff School, that was put forth by General Bina Machado, and it was to mirror that of the United States educational system. And that basically describes the transformation of the school as a consequence to increase exposure of Brazilian officers to their U.S. counterparts. And we gave a little description of that. But in the process, the educational complex was the most prestigious school and basically professionalizing select elements of the civilian sector, particularly for the sake of industrialists. And, basically why they created the school was to, allow the armed forces responsible for national security to intervene in the general power of the nation and ensure that the nation is basically under the machine gun laws. I mean, basically, they wanted a machine gun authoritarian dictatorship that was able to ensure that they had complete power over the political system, and they restructured the political system for no political parties. These are the white, racist, gangsters, murderous, butcher, genocidal, war criminal whites of the United States Congress and its presidents. In this time, it was Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk. These are war criminals. These are war criminals that should be jailed forever. They should have been jailed, or they should have been hanged as the Hitler Nazis were hanged in Nazi Germany, yet they were let to walk free because the U.S. is a mafia criminal state. It is a criminal state of white, murderous, butcher war criminals. So that was one additional aspect. In addition, we talked about, the external enemy threatening the military due to, increasing the democratic process. They found it threatening to have democracy push the people towards, a successful situation. Making democracy was a threat to the U.S. government and the Brazilian military generals that were indoctrinated by the U.S. government. So that was clearly, the opposite of what is a normal approach, what is a normal European approach to democracy. The U.S. was, flouting. They were saying that we don't need this approach to democracy. It is a machine gun approach to people. It is a machine gun approach to human values and human rights. In addition to that, we had... So Castelo Branco was basically obsessed with communist takeover. The Cold War came in, and there was an obsession with communist takeover. This was a conspiracy by the United States for them to enslave the third world peoples. They used the threat of communism, quote unquote, communism or Soviet influence in these nations that were wanting to nationalize and had no connection with the Soviet Union. All of their coups and military dictatorships, all of their massive war, extermination campaigns, those in Indochina, in South America, including Brazil, Guatemala, all Allende in Chile, all of these people were, this was a communist conspiracy that was a made-up threat, that was a fabrication of reality. They wanted to just enslave the Chilean people, the Guatemalan people, and the Indochinese people, the Indonesian people, in all of these coups, these right-wing dictatorships and military dictatorship for the threat of communism were just so that the U.S. could control the natural resources, the capitalist white frauds of Washington's, capitalist elite could, steal the natural resources, the oil from all of these places, and, place it into their capitalist white hands, and then enslave the people and get, fun from, repression, from police repression, from brutality of the white police, brutal, murderers, and, that sort of thing, the torture squads and all of that. So that was basically the Cold War, the communist threat. It was a feigned threat. It was a threat of falsity. It was falsity of the U.S. government and their threat. And then finally, we saw Argentinian discussion, the Cold War worldview. Foreign officers exposed to U.S. military programs were being proselytized and encouraged those officers to view their own countrymen who advocated redistribution of wealth or, betterment or quote unquote communist, the way communism was envisioned by Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and all of the South Americans, including Fidel Castro, a big, Hispanic, person who knew about communism, as well as Che Guevara, a Bolivian national or Argentinian national that was, resettled in Bolivia and murdered by the U.S. white murderous butchers. He was murdered in cold blood by the U.S. CIA and its murderous white, mafia, murderous, war criminals. That's what ended up happening. And then finally, it is not suggested that Brazilian officers who have governed their country for the past decade were lacking in self-motivation or were unwilling to convert to the Cold War view. It appears that they grasped it enthusiastically and proceeded to refine it to meet their precise needs. It is suggested, however, this worldview and the fact that it was being marketed by the world's greatest military power, the United States, providing them the justification and legitimation required for pursuing their own sweeping ambitions, which was to military rule the country and take the money to the capitalists. Some of the implications of this worldview for the policy and operations of the U.S. military were elaborated in the next chapter, which is policy and operations, which we're not going to go through today. That'll be tomorrow. So I believe we'll finish the book tomorrow. There's about 260 pages. It's 60 pages left. So I think, there's one chapter, policy and operations. Second chapter is institutional interest and defense strategy. And then there's beneficiary and victims. There's part 4, security for whom beneficiary and victims of the penetrative process, and then finally the conclusion chapter. So I think we'll finish it all tomorrow. It may take a little longer, maybe 2 hours 15 or 2 hours and 20 minutes, but I think that's the best way so that we can stop short now and finish with our closing remarks. So again, United States penetration of Brazil. Please download the book at the Google Drive link, and I'm glad you could join us today. We're going to finish with some closing remarks. Please, download the book at the Google link. Like I said, today's session, I didn't make any statement changes at all, so it's about the same as the book, but I think reading the book is definitely a plus, definitely a requirement. If you want to follow the U.S. penetration of Brazil, you should read the book. We would like to discuss certain key concepts of the chapters we have reviewed recently. First is Celso Furtado, an economist of Brazil and promoter of Brazilian progress and peasant uplifting. He was the major Jao Goulart economist who was responsible for labor unions and the labor promotion and peasant wages. Following the United States military coup by the racist whites of Washington, he was imprisoned and deprived of political rights by the U.S. government. He was not a criminal, but a political prisoner who was equated to a common criminal by the criminally insane government, gun-violent war criminal butchers of the United States. His major achievement for the Goulart government was SUDENE, that's SUDENE, which was the brainchild of Celso Furtado and the labor union force of Brazil, which answered directly to President Goulart and enjoyed administrative autonomy. It was responsible for the planning and execution of development projects. SUDENE was empowered to coordinate programs drawing upon both national and foreign technical assistance. We should also discuss Anthony Russo, a member of the infamous RAND Corporation, who proclaimed that prisoner torture is great. Vietnam torture was excellent, and he was a pro-Asian, a pro-murder of Asians, white man. Vietnamese prisoners, as well as prisoners that this white fraud capitalist, Anthony Russo, refers to are not common prisoners, but political prisoners who were murdered by the United States, criminally insane war criminals. RAND was also a key part of Indonesia coup, a group of murderers of white corporates who look to torture to feel that they are in control of prisoners, whether political or criminal. Mr. Russo said, quote, "You need to drop political prisoners into the sea. They're good for nothing." Political prisoners, good for nothing, question mark? Political prisoners are leftists that the U.S. government, gun violent, criminally insane war criminal butchers are unable to deal with, as they are fascist suppressors of dissent of their white supremacy fraud capitalism. Russo was also in favor of death squads in the United States dealing with political prisoners in Brazil. He was in support of murdering them by dropping them into the ocean, similar to the dropping of slaves into Europe into the sea. Anthony Russo, a racist white American murderous capitalist of RAND Corporation, said these things. Next, we address subversion of democracy. Kidnapping and surveillance by knowing where the political adversaries are and then illegally abducting them against the international laws. Theodore Brown was an aide chief public safety advisor who promoted the lack of democratic elections in state governments in Brazil in favor of police capitalists serving autocrats, and also promoted the use of the state police to overthrow the federal Brazilian government using courses in the United States in training for subversion of democracy, police repression, and white American police brutality. He also was questioned regarding the U.S. promotion of Brazilian death squads, which were used to deal with political prisoners by United States government, who was responsible for the murder of these democratic and popular political forces in Brazil through individual abduction, murder, imprisonment, and in favor of military machine gun violent white police terrorist government. U.S. also used state police in Brazil to overthrow Goulart. They fortified state police with training courses to teach them how to enact a coup, how to overthrow, and how to deal with political prisoners by racist torture. Also, subversion was taught to the trainees of the Brazilian police in U.S. training centers. U.S. American white police brutality, the U.S. police force, and its racist training centers taught the Latin American police brutality techniques through torture and murder, especially if political leftists and anyone with dissenting political viewpoints were in conflict with the U.S. gun-violent war criminal murderers. These Americans are criminally insane whites of the United States. Political prisoners are not criminals, but the U.S. fascist gun-violent murderers view them as equivalent to criminals, allowing them to release their programs of racist torture, kidnapping, and all sorts of technology and murder to deal with political prisoners with impunity, and openly supported their fascist state. Surveillance and kidnapping of civilians was the focus of these courses, teaching the techniques to subjugate third world people with police repression, including death squads. These included police which were trained in the United States to torture with techniques of amputation, neck snapping, airway obstruction, and death. Electric shock are all given in the murder and torture capital of the world, Washington, as well as other U.S. cities. One more course we discussed was the press journalism courses in the United States. These courses were involved with fabrication journalism, how to fabricate stories, propagate deliberate lies and frauds, and how to incorporate fabrication into democratic subversion. This is in line with the American training program of state propaganda journalism and fraud news reporting. So that's it. 2 hours and 7 minutes. Tomorrow, please join me for most likely the final podcast of United States Penetration of Brazil. Will complete the book. I have a playlist at the end. Please access the playlist. It has some more descriptions and the book Google Drive link. It's also in the description section, the Google Drive link. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.